thank you, Mark, and thank you for everybody coming here, for your support of both the monastic communities, new faces, old faces, total new faces for me, so in a lot of cases. But thank you for your support. I'd like to ask everybody to give a round of applause to Mark for his efforts for tonight. It's very important that we give gratitude to Mark because this has been 12 months in the making, and I've received countless text messages into the monastery from Mark, totally frustrated, trying to organise everybody into their particular areas to try and make this night happen over the last 365 days. And he's kept me up, and I've had to, when he sent me the third or fourth time, I realised I have to respond. And we've got a good working relationship, but I realised only the last few weeks how much sacrifice and time he's given. But my experience in Teddy then, when I first heard it, was I was quite scandalised because it actually doesn't mean anything. It's just a sound. It's just a bunch of syllables added in during a particular high point, usually during Matins, at the end of the Podereos, where they extend the mood of the church service. Now, I thought, why would you actually want to torture people with extra chanting in church? Because Russians work by the clock, right? It's all right, nothing against the Russians. But when I first heard it as a young fellow, when I was just turning 21, I thought, why on earth would you want to extend a 14-hour vigil? Because the Teddy Dem I listened to went for 55 minutes. Now, and I think it's a very important segue of what the choir brought into tonight and that introduction to Hagia Sophia, because it was in this particular church that the Teddy Dem culture movement was created for one particular reason. It was because the emperor was always late to church. And so one of the ways that the choirs used to practice in waiting, because they could not start the church, particularly in the high-end culture of the 9th century Byzantine Empire, under people like Basil I, Basil II, that they had to find a way to wait and warm their voices in preparation for the emperor to come with his entourage so that the church service could begin. And of course, Basil II, as some of you might know, was a particularly warmongering emperor, and he was bopping off his enemies left, right, and centre, and so he's always late to church. But it was actually in Hagia Sophia that the Teddy Dem was one of those strange little warming up pieces to extend or to create a feeling of opening up the church service, even though it doesn't really mean anything. Although when I did ask a Greek priest of blessed memory back in Melbourne about 15 years ago, his wife pulled me aside and said, "It's the chant that the angels used to sing to Jesus Christ when he was in the manger." And I thought, wow, really? So, of course, I got told the truth later on, but it had nothing to do with the angels singing Teddy Dem to Christ in the manger. But regardless of which, Hagia Sophia, in the context of the history of the Orthodox Church, epitomizes the entire liturgical life of the Orthodox Church. What do I mean by that? Hagia Sophia was a huge building. It was an edifice that encompassed a very vast architectural, geometrical space that stood on a hill. And everybody that came through the Bosphorus through the Black Sea, and from the Mediterranean up into the Black Sea and vice versa, you could not help but see it from a distance. It was so magnificent, so large, it felt like the Giza pyramids in Egypt in terms of its momentous feeling. And it's particularly somber that this week, just 3 days ago, in the year 1453, that Hagia Sophia fell to the Ottoman Turks. And that history in itself is not only tragic, but a very important lesson, because on the night of the 25th of May in 1453, when the church was taken, you have to understand that the walls were breached, the church was barred, and inside the church were about 15 to about 1,800 people of about 15 different nationalities who were in various forms of prayer and in preparation for their last breath in life. And tradition has it that the Greek priests, or the priests serving the Eucharist, went and took the holy gifts and disappeared into the north wall of the church. And a prophecy has come down that when the end times approaches, the last liturgy, according to a Greek prophecy, is that the priests will return from the south wall with the gifts in hand to complete the divine liturgy that was never finished on that night of the 25th of May in the year 1453. The significance of this church in the Orthodox world was so expansive and had such an effect that the clergy and that the people of the Orthodox Church wore black. And the reason why we moved to black cassocks and black wear was actually to do in commemoration for the sorrow of the loss of the greatest, the longest standing, and the most important Christian building in the entire planet had ever known. It had lasted for almost 900 years by itself as a building. It was an incredible edifice. The effect emotionally on the planet and to all Orthodox Christians, including Russia, which I'll talk about a bit later, was so important that black became the symbol. It became the expression of sorrow, of the loss of the greatest Christian monument in the world. It wasn't until the 14th century that the French built a great cathedral that was bigger than Hagia Sophia. So the particular picture you can see on the two screens, one up there and one on my left there, is actually overlooking the ocean, taken from a drone, overlooking the Bosphorus Channel. Behind it is the water of the channel that moves up into the Black Sea and into Russia. So even in the contemporary age in Constantinople, the Church of Hagia Sophia has an extremely powerful impact on Christians, non-Christians, and also the Muslim community, the Turks who, I won't go into too much talk about Turkey now, but a very secular type of Islamic culture, I have to say, and even they have a certain pride and respect. Don't forget that on the night when they took the Byzantine, when they took the church, that the night was a waning crescent of the moon. And when Islam decided to find a symbol to claim its victory over the Urumi, the Romans, because that's what Islam has always called the Byzantines and us, Urumi, the Romans, that they depicted, as you can see in the flags, the closing crescent of the moon as the symbol of the taking of the city of Constantinople on the 25th of May 1453. And so all Muslim countries have adopted that symbol. So there's a bit of a map just there behind. I'm going to talk now more specifically about Hagia Sophia itself. Probably the middle map up there has actually got a better picture of actually what we're talking about, the extent of some of the Byzantine Empire. And just that islet down the bottom down there, you can see right down the end of the peninsula is St. Sophia. And there's a contemporary view of seeing St. Sophia today. What I do want to mention that's quite interesting in regards to how and why this church was built in the first place. Without going into the name, because it's quite interesting, controversial history itself. And we hear about it in the homilies of St. John Chrysostom when he starts complaining about the horse races outside of church. And you would think, why would anybody have horse race outside of church? You think about your local church, think of a horse track that goes literally 50 meters just outside the door, that stretches for 4 kilometers in its radius. It was immense. The Hippodrome in Constantinople was built literally on the doorstep of the church. When you walked out of church, it was a concoction of horse smell and lots of screaming and shouting people. It was not a peaceful environment outside the church. And so in the year 525, there was a particular horse race, and we're not talking about Ben-Hur, we're talking about a hippodrome that Ben-Hur would have ridden in, but the horse races itself were highly politicized and very interesting and very controversial. One of the things that we have to remember is that the horse races itself weren't in chariots. They were literally on imagine a skateboard put sideways with the wheels pointing the other direction, with the ropes coming from underneath the board on little wheels, and the person who lasted to the end after his crazy horse race on a couple of skateboards was the winner. It was not chariots as in Ben-Hur. And one of the big misconceptions that chariots are actually only ridden by very wealthy soldiers and emperors and the army. But horse races itself were a nasty, torrid, ugly affair. And you can think to yourself, why on earth would the Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire, would be promoting horse races outside its main cathedral, the city, and pushing people around on such a dangerous sport, and want to spend more time there than in church? I have no answer for that. But just to think, simply just for a minute, the crazy contradiction that the Christian empire of the middle of the 6th century was at, you begin to see the humanity, that it's very little difference between a crazy hippodrome horse race in 525 to the state of origin between New South Wales and Queensland. Human beings need blood sports. I'm sorry, right? I'm not a sports fanatic. I used to follow the Bulldogs and all those sorts of things, right? Yay! Yeah, I see my friends out there. Brothers. But literally, the difference when you look at this is why history becomes really important, interesting, is that even though it was a Christian, God-fearing society, and even though Justinian was going to be later claimed a great man and a saint and the builder of the most important Christian monument in the world, the horse race was central to the life of the empire. And it was one particular nasty, hot, ugly summer day that things got out of control between the blue team and the green team. Literally, New South Wales and Queensland. The green team wore green shirts and green armbands. The blue team wore the blue, like New South Wales. And they were affiliated between the upper class and the working class, between the Greens and the Blues. And things got out of control because there was a plague that hit the city. The first of the bubonic plagues had actually started creating a problem on the edges of the empire and wiping out vast tracts of the population, both Christian. The Muslims weren't really moving through at this time. They were just starting around in Persia. But in 525, the bubonic plague was dropping tens of thousands of people. Now, we don't think tens of thousands of people is a lot compared to the Spanish influenza of 1918, but at that time, per ratio of population, it was decimating the culture. And one of the church services we have at the beginning of the Mission Fast on the 14th of August, on the old calendar that is, I should say, is that we celebrate the small blessing of water because it's the beginning of the fall season in the Northern Hemisphere, that when the bubonic plague historically moved through the empire. And we still carry that tradition in the entire Orthodox Church today. Not many different people say, why do we need to have another water blessing service on the 14th or the 2nd or 1st of August for the new calendar? The reason is because of the bubonic plague that started striking the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. So death was imminent. But anyway, back to the horse race. New South Wales and Queensland are literally at each other's throats. And the Emperor had a box seat in the middle of the stadium. And he had a tunnel that took him literally back to his private chambers behind the horse track, the hippodrome. He decided not to contend or make peace with the factions. And when the blue and green team saw that the Praetorian Guard and soldiers weren't there to stop the mischief making, things got really ugly and people got killed in fisticuffs and knives and fights. Within the next 5 days, scholars believe between 20,000 and 30,000 people were slaughtered in one of the most ugliest events of the Byzantine Empire. The troops ended up killing a lot of the people. It was a very, very sad and tragic event. It was this particular event that affected Justinian so badly, he was almost ready to abdicate, that when he saw that the church where Hagia Sophia, which is there now, stands on, the church had been ruined, and he thought the only way that I could bring healing to the empire, as he stood on his alcove, watching the dust and ashes descend in the azure of the carnage, he very calmly had a vision immediately to plant and build a church on a spot that he knew had to be built for the sake of not just healing, but was going to be a complete expression of a new way of thinking about churches. What actually is a church? What is a church going to be? The reason why Justinian was justified in doing this is because he was a very effeminate type of bloke. He never picked up a sword. He never fought in battle. He read lots of books. He was trained by Greek philosophers. He was Roman by nature, but spoke and read Greek philosophy. He was not Greek. Sorry, Greek, my Greek friends. He was not Greek, but he did speak Greek, and he wanted Hellenic philosophy to become a dominant expression within the new Roman Byzantine culture, much more than any other emperor had before. That Constantine also wasn't Greek, but he had no idea about Greek mysticism or philosophy. He just kept everything very Roman. But Justinian was a really interesting person because he was at this moment, he decided in the carnage, in this contradiction, that he was going to relabel what a church actually is. And so he built this edifice within 8 years of such a massive scale through philosophers, Pythagorean philosophers, who were not Christian, who were the architects, two of them very famous, who designed the geometry in the inner space of the church based purely on the sense of cosmic divine order. So that when you walked into church, it wasn't going to be a building, but was going to be an expression of heaven coming to earth. You can see there in the photo, there behind, that the Hippodrome is a monstrous building. It dominated the entire landscape. So, Hagia Sophia was built in 8 years, and when Justinian came inside it, his first words were, "Glory be to God, Solomon, I have surpassed you." They were the exact words. He actually said something between those two lines, but I can't remember the top of my head. But the two important lines, his first words were, "Glory be to God." Because what he was able to achieve was extraordinary. In terms of the type of material he was able to gather, and the fact that he was able to marble, buying all this marble from around the world, which then at that time was considered to be equivalent to gold in terms of its value. And we think to ourselves, why would a church being built out of marble paneling be considered something very beautiful? And it's something that Justinian talked about in the chronicles of one of the historians, I can't remember his name just off the top of my head, starts with P, that he talks about one of the reasons why marble becomes an important material, because it's a sedimentary material built out of shells, calcium carbonate, that has been deposited and compressed in the ocean floor over time immemorial. We do not know when. We have the time scale of the Old Testament, but there is also another understanding of the mystical time of the creation of heaven and earth before man began to exist in Adam and Eve, where the formation of the earth was a tremendous geological, let's say, eruptive experience. Marble is seashells compressed into rock formation and oxidized and reduced under different pressures and temperatures. And when the islands shift and move up, then you can go to the cliffs and to the edges, and you can carve and cut the marble. And if you cut it correctly, and if you find a good source, when you slice the marble open, you create these incredible patterns. Justinian wanted the entire church to be covered from top to bottom, except for the cupola, the dome at the top, to be covered with marble. The floor to almost the very top of the ceiling. And when you first walk in, everything's a bit grey. You can't quite see because the light's a little bit dim. The reason why Justinian wanted to put the marble into the church was not for beautification, but was simply to express the order of the mystery of creation. Timeless, immemorial creation. Now, when I first heard this theory, I thought it was all a little bit too mystical for me. And so I had a Russian archaeologist that I happened to meet one of my trips there from Moscow, whose specialty is in hierotopia, which is symbolism of mysticism within architecture and art of the different Christian eras. A very vague and abstract philosophy. But he took me up into the church, into the center of the floor, and he took me to one edge of the northern wall, and he says, look at this marble pattern. Everybody else is focusing on the dome, looking at various icons and this icon here, and everyone's taking selfies. And everyone, but he says, come up to the edge of the paneling here, and I'm going to show you something. And he takes me up to the edge of the paneling, and then in the paneling of the marble is these disfigurements within the marble patterning, and I couldn't quite work out what they are. And I said, what's special about that? He says, do you know what those blotches are? Look carefully, what do you think they are? And I looked again, and are fossils stuck inside the marble paneling that had been embedded and that the builders had intentionally left created into the edge of the paneling of the church. I said, why hasn't anybody picked them out, or why are they still there, or why did they leave them there? He says, He says, because the reason why there were hardly any icons in Hagia Sophia was because they wanted the marble paneling to be the icon of creation in church. Not to have lots of figures of saints, or to paint lots of blue walls, or to paint gold stars in the ceiling, although that's another topic in itself, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the fact was that the marble paneling in the church was not for decoration. It was all connected to Psalm 103, which is the psalm of we sing every day for Vespers about the creation and the order of nature that the Orthodox Church sings every single day. And so for the first time I began to see the cosmos, or the world of the liturgy, in a much broader sense. That having been brought up in the old Russian Orthodox Church, which I love very dearly to my heart, that I began to see for a very different set of, let's say, or the glasses were being taken off, and I was starting to see something different for the first time. That the understanding of the liturgy, or the church of Hagia Sophia, was so complex, philosophically abstract, and mystical, that that people, or that generation of thinking of Justinian and his entourage of architects and thinkers was so highly developed that it made me realize that they were true giants of liturgical reformation of the church. We haven't been able to come, forgive me if I offend anybody, come close in being able to emulate church architectural design, which I'll talk a little bit later in my closing remarks, since this church. So what was built in this church was not just a church, but that you were entering into eternity before time began. So the Teddy Dem was highly applicable to sing in terms of a timeless chant, just waiting, being there for whenever it's just going to happen. Being totally relaxed. And that's one of the things I love about the Greek Orthodox Church that it took me a while to get used to, is that when a Russian comes to church, he dresses up, crosses himself 3 times, and stands rigid like a soldier, and comes to do his service to the church. When a Greek comes to church, he sighs, finds a seat, and relaxes, and starts to fall asleep. It's very interesting. I thought, why are they so lazy in church? Why can't they be standing upright like the Russians? I had many interesting stories in that Athos and seeing Russian monastics and Greek monastics behaving in a totally different way. But it's because in the Byzantine culture, for me, what I saw within their church atmosphere was that they felt church was actually home. It was an extension of their home life. They were totally, completely connected to within the church structure. It wasn't going to be important. It was actually going to be connected to where they really are, to paradise, to earth. Different cultural thoughts and understandings, if you can get my gist. So that's just an interesting thing that I've noticed over time in my travels. But this church was a very clean, interesting expression of that. One of the interesting challenges that I've seen in the Orthodox Church in post-1453 is how the model of Hagia Sophia, if it's to be understood as a very beautiful and important church, how is it that it hasn't been able to be copied? Or, the architecture. Why haven't we been able to redo the same? Not in terms of scale, but in terms of the concept. Not just about marble, but in terms of space. Because when you walk into the church, the idea that Justinian wanted to create, as I just said in terms of creation, was that the dome in the church was a very, very flat ceiling. It was very large, round circle. It was so flat that it collapsed in the next earthquake. About 70 years later, had to get rebuilt a couple of times. But one of the most interesting things that this Russian professor I was with that helped talk me through the understanding of the symbols of this church was that Justinian's thinking about the dome on the inside of the cupola of the church was so low that even though it's 180 feet high to the center of the dome, but it was so flat that when you looked up, you felt a little bit that being squashed by the ceiling sort of moving down on you. The reason being was that they wanted the idea of heaven touching earth, that there was going to be the bridge of the Son of Man seeing the angels and descending upon man, as it is written in the story in the account of Nathanael under the fig tree in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, that the church was going to be a bridge between heaven and earth. So compare that to when I went to Notre Dame in Paris, and the ceiling was so high that you couldn't see where the ceiling ended because it's all quite dark at the top of the Notre Dame Cathedral. And one of the things that came across to me in my thinking and talking to a couple of tour guides was that heaven in the Western Church was something that had to have a feeling of separation. And that's something that was not unattainable, but you had to lift yourself so high, to work so hard to reach it, because you were so sinful. The idea of the original sin, the concept of the Augustinian teaching that was misappropriated by Western theology later on becomes a heresy for us in the Orthodox Church. Whereas in the Eastern Church, the relationship between God and man was a much more intimate and personal expression, that when you went to church, you could feel that heaven was coming to you, rather than you having to feel bad that you weren't going to make it to heaven at all. There we have one of the very interesting and most important differences between Eastern and Western theology, expressed through the architecture of the church, that I haven't thought of, but has actually been written and has been thought of by specialists over many, many centuries. So to finish off, my complaint, or one of the most ironic things that I've seen, is that the template of the architecture of Hagia Sophia has been successfully copied not by the Orthodox, but by Islam. And if you go for a little quiet drive down to Auburn, down the local hood, you see the exact miniature copy of Hagia Sophia. Why? Why would Islam be so interested in copying Hagia Sophia? Because they had been sitting around the edges of the Byzantine Empire for 500 years, waiting to capture this particular building because they knew that geometrically, mathematically, architecturally, spiritually, it was the centerpiece of the entire planet of faith, more than Jerusalem for them. And so when they captured it on the 25th of May 1453, when Suleiman, I call him the massacrist, but they call him the magnificent, he's not magnificent for me or for us, he took off his turban and got on his knees, got the marble dust that had come onto the floor from the soldiers just massacring everybody, and poured it on his head because he realized that this was the crowning achievement of the high end of so-called Muslim culture at that time, to the extent that he decided to build the Blue Mosque next door on a slightly larger scale, particularly exclusively for Islam. And because the Ottoman Empire becomes so powerful and dominant, it becomes what's called the blueprint for all mosques around the planet. It came from Justinian's building. And so there's my complaint, is that we've lost the ownership, so to speak, of the church in regards to what this church meant, and that when I see contemporary churches being built, even though it might not be Russian, it might not be Serbian, it might not be Macedonian, it might not be Egyptian, that we have to make sure in the morality of this little topic and talk that we never, ever forget history, not for sentimental reasons, but that we know how to walk forward in both church architecture, in church liturgical reform, in a way that the Byzantines were able to give to us, that we should take and continue to learn from. Because we are now entering into very dark and dangerous times with fake news, Donald Trump and all those sorts of things that are going on, that we don't know what truth is anymore out in the world, and we don't know where the churches and the politics of societies and governments and the slippery deals that are happening between high-end institutions that are dictating us anymore. But we know one thing that we can learn from history is that they knew how to make church culture, and that this is why history is very important for us to learn from. The last thing I'll say is regards to the Russians in particular, because we can't forget the Russians in all this, is that this is where Russian Orthodoxy technically was born from. In the year 986, what we can call basically the high end of liturgical reform under Patriarch Photius, who was a very interesting man himself, he invited some Norsemen, Rus, to come down for a little boat trip. Now don't forget, for 150 years before 986, the Rus Vikings were pillaging up and down the shores of the Byzantine capital and causing outrageous grievances to the Byzantine emperors and culture. They were ransacking monasteries, they were burning churches and houses, they were stealing nice Greek princesses and all that sort of stuff, right? These Russians were, well, Rus Vikings were very, very naughty. In 986, without going into the story of Vladimir Monomakh, he decided to send us a group of entourages and groups around the world to discover what is going to be the true faith. And you can read in the Chronicles without going into details of what the answers were, but it was in Hagia Sophia in the year 986 when they came for one of those 14-hour vigils. Can you imagine Vikings coming to a 14-hour vigil? Are we there yet? That they actually saw at the apse, which I've got in that picture up there, in the very top of the altar, that particular mosaic was literally finished something like 18 months before. And it was very new, very avant-garde in terms of artistic mosaic quality. It was actually controversial because it wasn't Romanesque enough for the Byzantine, for certain pious conservative Byzantines at the time. So that particular mosaic has a very marked place when you walk into the church and you look for the position of the altar, which can be a little bit hard to find in the beginning when you get there. It is one of the most interesting, overwhelming, beautiful figures that captures the glances of every single person in the church. It was that particular image, one of only of a dozen images in the church, don't forget, there's hardly any icons in the church, that affected them from the light coming from the altar bouncing into the golden mosaic, that the Russians said, "We do not know whether we were on heaven or on earth, but we know God exists here." And it was that message that they took back from that particular church service in 986 back to Kiev to tell Vladimir that they had the answer he was looking for. And so convincing of their personal, spiritual, religious, not as Christians, as Vikings, that they convinced Vladimir, who wasn't an easy person to convince, that this was what they were looking for. And in 2 years' time, in a very miraculous, speedy development, the Russian Orthodox, well, the Russian Empire, Rus, becomes officially baptized as Orthodox into the Byzantine Empire. A very good note to finish on that talk. Thank you very much.